and welcome to the U.S. Chamber Foundation's Path Forward series. The COVID-19 pandemic, which we've covered extensively on this program, has sent shockwaves through our economy, and it has called attention to the complexity of global supply chains. As demand has surged and production has halted in many parts of the world, consumers have become acutely aware how delicate the global supply chain really is. Now, new lockdowns in China and Russia's war in Ukraine are putting increased strains on the flow of goods around the world. Today, we'll unpack what the current situation means for global supply chains and how we can rebuild strong supply chains for the future. Joining us today is Dr. Yanzhong Huang, Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations and co-chair of the U.S.-China Working Group for the CSIS Commission on Strengthening America's Health Security. Joining us from Hong Kong is Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis. We're also delighted to welcome Dr. Andrea Little Limbago, Senior Vice President of Research and Analysis with Interos Inc. Also with us is Renato Scaff, Senior Managing Director of Strategy and Consulting, Supply Chain and Operations, and North America Lead for Accenture. Let's get right to it. So, Dr. Huang, it has been really a challenge to get reliable information about the state of the pandemic in China, but it's clear that COVID-19 is currently spreading there. What's your assessment of where things stand today and where they're going to go in the coming weeks and months?
Well, thank you, Susan, for inviting me to this event. I think we all know about in terms of situation in China. But Shanghai is still under lockdown. It's been for almost 1 month. Likely they're going to partially lift the lockdown on the 28th. And Beijing is likely moving to a full lockdown. They just announced that from 26th until 30th, they're going to conduct 3 rounds of mass PCR testing on 90% of the city's population. And for other cities, some are still under lockdown. Some are moving to impose lockdown. Balto just yesterday announced they are going to impose a lockdown. Well, remember, for those who don't know, Balto, it's the China's rare earth mineral hub. They provided, I think, 43% of the world's rare earth minerals. And still others, they're under certain restrictions, measures as well. So essentially, we're seeing this entire country seems to be like a large number of isolated islands, and we are not expecting the government to change fundamentally the zero COVID policy in the coming months.
A little bit more about a zero COVID policy. Is it even realistic at this stage of the pandemic?
Well, the government, certainly what the leaders, but they're still convinced that this is the only correct approach in coping with the pandemic. But we know implementing of that approach is increasingly difficult. It is incurring higher social economic cost, right, in terms of the separation of families, the impact on the economy, and that approach is also facing diminishing returns problem. To some extent, it becomes counterproductive. In fact, there seems to be evidence suggesting that in Shanghai, large percentage of that infection is caused by the mass PCR testing, which is an important component of that zero COVID strategy. And so they're going to face sustainability issues, when benefits increasing significantly, exponentially. Well, they're soon going to exceed the cost. But the bottom line is that zero COVID strategy, they cannot eradicate the virus. Right? By shielding the population from the virus through zero COVID strategy, they're sustaining the immunity gap between China and the rest of the world. But the irony is that this would only make the zero COVID policy more justifiable.
Yeah, and we've talked on this show before, it's even more complicated because allowing the virus to run like that, of course, lets it mutate. And so it does get more complex. So, some estimates say that there are 344 million people on lockdown. And so it's hard to imagine what's happening there. Food scarcities and closed restaurants and shops and all kinds of suspension of operations. How bad is it right now?
Well, well, simply speaking, very bad, right? When you have truck drivers, I'm sorry, you have truck drivers, stuck on the highway. That affects 3/4 of the volume of freight. This is going to be a huge disruption to the supply chain. In fact, I just saw a study conducted by the scholars at Chinese University of Hong Kong. They used location data of nearly 2 million trucks crisscrossing China. And they found that a full-scale lockdown on 4 largest cities in China, that is Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Beijing, and Shanghai, this 4 cities under lockdown for 1 month would reduce the real national GDP by 8.6%. And if we talk about by imposing lockdown on all Chinese cities, China is going to see the reduction of real national GDP by 53%. And in the meantime, we're seeing in Shanghai, only thousands of ships are waiting offshore at the port of Shanghai. I don't know whether I could share the screen, but well, maybe later. But because of this lockdown in the city, these ships, right, they cannot be guided into the port. Right. And that makes exports to China a big challenge. Right. I just read this case on Chile. Right, the fruit industry is badly hit by the lockdown in China because it typically takes 30 days to export goods to the country. Now it becomes at least 2 months. So with that long, right, that's this long, right, this delay, right, the quality of the fruits is affected. That is going to lower the price sold in the Chinese market, while in the meantime, the shipping cost increased 3 times. Right? Domestic, that is not just going to hurt the foreign companies, it's hurt Chinese domestic manufacturers as well. I just spoke with one of my friends who's they run a factory making these cosmetic products. They have difficulties to import raw materials for production. And their products now also have difficulty to ship, right, to the hospitals, which mostly, right, are either closed or actually no longer, right, have the people, right, to take those products.
But Dr. Wang, you make such an important point. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You make such an important point about the impact on the economy. Before I bring in the next panelist, I have to ask you one more question about that, which is, how do we educate policymakers, both here and in China, about the real impacts? I mean, respectfully, without being disrespectful to the Chinese government, what is the way to best increase the understanding about what's really going on?
Well, this is the problem with some people call the totalitarian feedback loop, right? Because there's a lack of sound feedback loop mechanism. Well, that is especially a case when you have the top leader surrounded by people who have no interest in bringing bad news, right? So this lack of formal routine and reliable systematic channels and indicators to assess the effectiveness of the policy, highlight the importance of those informal and random means, right, to bring that up to the leaders, to so that he recognizes there is a problem. So if you a chance for to tell the Chinese leader, but this is the problem, you cannot continue like that. I would encourage everyone to do that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wang. I have more questions for you. We're already getting audience questions for you, so we'll be back to you in just a minute. But first, let me bring in Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrera, who is the chief economist for the Asia Pacific for, am I saying this right, Natexis?
Correct.
Oh, good. Thank you. So we were just listening to Dr. Huang about the devastating impact of the shutdown in China in regard to food and, of course, other basic necessities. From your perspective, Doctor, what is the situation on the ground?
Well, I very much agree with the description of the situation. Is actually terrible, not only socially, but economically. And I'm going to focus on that aspect. I think what we need to realize is that we are increasingly close to the loss of mobility at the national level that we saw in the first months of 2020. So we need to start thinking about that kind of shock for the global economy. So we are 60%, 40% only away from that terrible situation. And this means that manufacturing is being affected. So in about 40% of China's GDP, factories are either closed or undergoing enormous types of restrictions, which make their productivity much slower, and this is affecting China's ability to produce. We're going to see that in April data. We're not yet there, but we will see it in the data if we do. We see it already in electricity consumption, clearly down. We see it in cement data. Then we have, beyond manufacturing, of course, we see consumption. The consumption of services has plummeted because people can't go to restaurants. Already in March, retail sales for restoration were minus 18%. So it is really bad. And then we can talk later about what really matters to the world, with is logistics, exports. It is quite dramatic.
So is your view that this is a short-term blip that can be overcome, or a long-lasting economic situation?
Well, we've learned from our own experience that COVID is a short-term, cyclical, basically. I mean, it's just, of course, breaking the cycle wherever it was. In China, it was already on a decelerating mode. We know that because we've been suffering from deceleration since the second half of 2021. We know that the government had in mind certain policies, fiscal, monetary, to smooth that deceleration and grow 5.5% this year from 8% last year, 8.1. So the point is that COVID is going to bring that growth rate down to, depending on how long it lasts, could be 2% like 2020, could be 3%, could be 4% if it only ends in early May. So that degree of deterioration will depend on the length of COVID. I have to say here that yesterday President Xi Jinping announced a major infrastructure stimulus. And the whole idea is to make up everything that we're losing now because of COVID, thanks to infrastructure. I want to clarify that as long as the zero COVID policy is in place, it will be very hard for China to grow out of infrastructure, because you need people to actually carry it out, and lockdowns make it very costly and very difficult. So I just want to say that the plan is still ahead, 5.5 growth, but I very much doubt China will manage this year.
I'm interested in what you're saying, and I'm sorry if this is a naive question, but I think I hear you say that on one hand, it could be a shorter term impact if you can use COVID as a guide, but on the other hand, the impact of the lockdowns could be longer, right? As it locks up more of the supply chains for too long and causes other economic ripples. And so the fear of the shutdowns as a relatively blunt weapon, does that contribute to a longer lasting economic problem and longer lasting supply chain clogs?
It's a great question, and you're absolutely right. In COVID, including the policy you choose to confront COVID, are short-term issues, but the consequences, or let's put it this way, the unintended consequences could be more structural. So let me give you one example. The most obvious for this conversation is, of course, global value chains. So if China, who already in March stopped, at least, it didn't stop importing, but the growth of imports was zero, actually below zero, doesn't manage to import, and there's a reason for this. There's many. One is the lack of demand because people are in lockdowns, but there's another reason related to the global value chain, which is that we now have quarantine for manufactured products. So anything that comes into China has 7-day quarantine rule. So there's a huge delay in imports. Now, for now, China managed to export in March data. It exported quite decently, 12%. This is good for China's growth. We know that external demand is very, very large because imports are plummeting. But we also know that a lot of those imports, a good share of those imports, are value chain related. They are intermediate goods for China to then re-export. If they can't import, they will not be able to export further with their value added. This means that foreign companies operating in China, which tend to have a larger share of intermediate goods imported from the rest of the world, will need to take decisions. And those decisions are structural. They may need to open a new plant elsewhere, find new ways to reshuffle the value chain. That's a structural, unintended consequence of COVID in China.
What do you think, which industries do you think are the most impacted in the way that you just described?
Great question. We wrote a report because you're right. I mean, we've learned so much from COVID. So now we know that the impact is very different. I'm going to basically focus on export-related value chain sectors, given the audience. But of course, for anybody who is invested in restaurants or traveling, leisure in China, especially traveling type leisure, these sectors are collapsing. Airlines, I mean, even domestic flight is basically close to zero. So that's the worst. But I think what matters most for foreign investors in China is, of course, the manufacturing sector. Some are in services, but generally is manufactured. So there, the two sectors that are doing worst are autos and semiconductors. And this is because they depend, again, same idea, on parts and components imported from the rest of the world, number one reason. And second, of course, they face the same constraints as any other company in China, which is the ability of workers to basically work in the factory. There, I have to say that China has come up, the Shanghai municipality has come up with a new memorandum of understanding to find ways for factories to continue to work, because they are very aware of the economic impact. But those agreements with companies are putting all of the brunt on any consequence related to COVID cases on the company. So companies are being very careful, and generally they're keeping their production much lower than they would have otherwise. Say Tesla. Tesla is at half the production capacity to comply with COVID protocols. So the impact is going to be there very clearly. The more components you need, because that makes the whole chain more difficult to carry out. And this is semiconductors and autos.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you one more economic question before we bring the next panelists in. Although, like Dr. Huang, I could ask you questions all day. I'm learning so much. Thank you. Tell me, here in the United States, we're talking a lot about inflation. We have inflation at a 40-year high. So that means we have people in the workforce who've never seen inflation before, experiencing it for the first time. What is your view of the situation you just described and its impact on inflation here?
Well, again, the only thing I can say is that we've learned a lot from COVID, and we've learned that any disruption in the value chain is basically inflationary, unless, and this is hopefully not the case. I'd rather have inflation than a new humongous COVID wave in the West again. But the point is that only that could help, because you would see a plummeting demand at some point. Yeah, plummeting demand means lower prices, lower demand, lower prices. As we speak, the situation in the world is that demand is coming down. I have to say that this is helpful, but still, because of China's logistical issues. So just an idea of how much longer it takes to basically prepare a container or air cargo, or in the case of Europe, we are also affected by railway transportation of goods beyond Ukraine, because many go through. So it is just humongously more expensive than before, as we all know. But I have to say something which explains a little bit what we heard before about Chile, is that there's one aspect of our inflation that relates to commodity prices. Yeah, this is one of the key contributors to inflation today. That one will actually be hit negatively by China, because China's own demand is plummeting. So the impact is mixed. You will have intermediate goods. China exports 1/3 of global intermediate goods into the rest of the world. That will be up. That's clearly going to be inflationary because of the logistical hurdles from China's ports all the way to the US. Instead, I actually think iron ore, copper, everything that China imports, being the largest importer in the world for all of these commodities, they're going to go down. Oil is unfortunately very dependent on the war in Ukraine. But if that war in a way subdues, or it comes to standstill, and there's no embargo from Europe, I think even oil prices will go down because of China's COVID. So I end up saying, because I wrote this 3 weeks ago, and I sensed it was going to happen, but I wasn't sure. I wrote a title of an op-ed saying that China will be a bigger shock for the global economy than Ukraine. And as a European, that's a big statement. But I do think this is a humongous inflationary shock on the one hand, but also deflationary for other items. So I'll finish here. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. It was a wonderful answer. A terrifying answer, but an important answer. So we will bring you back in for more questions in a minute. First, I want to turn and both to a new panelist, but also to bring the idea of the situation in Ukraine, which you just referenced, into the conversation. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Andrea Little Limbago, Senior Vice President at Interos. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Turning to the situation in Ukraine, and of course, we first think of the lives at risk and the human toll of what's happening in a really sad and complex situation there after the Russian invasion. But for the purposes of this program, talking about the economic toll and the impact on global supply chains, could you walk the audience through what you think the risks are given the situation in Ukraine?
Sure, yeah, and thanks for having me. As you pointed out, the human toll is obviously, the most paramount issue affecting. But as we look at some of the secondary impacts as well, we're seeing just enormous, ripple effects across the supply chain. You just heard a lot about how China's lockdown is impacting the ripple effects, and we're seeing similar kind of dynamics at play. We did some analysis at the beginning of Russia's invasion and saw about 300,000 different U.S. and European companies had suppliers within Russia or Ukraine, and that doesn't even take into consideration the extended supply chain. And as you go from third tier, fourth tier, and so forth, where there are all these dependencies, you do see those repercussions and disruptions are impacted due to the aspects of whether there are components there, whether there are different logistical components within the supply chain being located in that area. We're seeing those disrupted, and so that alone is an enormous aspect of it. And in turn, we're seeing the repercussions of market volatility and food and energy prices. That some of that was mentioned. The oil and gas volatility, absolutely, and seeing some various record spikes and so forth. But we're also seeing just really phenomenal transportation and logistics disruptions that are going on, where for instance, a major route from China into Europe is the railway going through Russia, and having that blocked off requires many companies to then look at alternate routes for their supply chains. And so you're seeing creativity required, innovation required to find out what those alternate routes might be. We're also seeing, for the automotive industry, for instance, you're having to see some aspects of either halting some of their production and assembly lines due to lack of materials, or they're having to just close a plant down due to inability to maintain some of the logistics. We've seen companies that actually have suspended shipments to China due to fears of the confiscation of Russia if they were to go across the Russian terrain. And so you see a lot of that going on. And then on top of all that, additional transformations going on toward the a continued movement towards various kinds of shoring. And so we hear about onshoring, and that's getting production within your country of interest, nearshoring, so within a broader region, ally shoring, and that's something that we'll probably talk about a fair amount, but moving sources of production to more of a trusted network and basically trusted countries of origin. And in that regard, we've seen about 750 global companies have left Russia as well from the start of this. And there's a professor at Yale, and also now I think working with New York Times, is keeping track of that long list of companies who have left and fled Russia from the invasion. So we're really seeing across all those different areas just major transformations going on, and some of them are already underway. The global reshuffling of supply chains, that was underway, but it has just significantly been accelerated yet again, first by the pandemic and now by Russia's invasion.
Thank you for that. You brought up something I'm really interested in. I know our audience is too, which is the impact of transportation logistics and the impact on transportation logistics. And one thing that might not be getting as much attention as it should is the long haul air traffic. Can you help our audience understand why in particular that's being disrupted and how?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point. It is, one, there's transportation writ large, which I alluded to a bit, but we're seeing that the closure of airspace, and so Moldova, Belarus, about a dozen different European countries have closed airspace for various, and then Russia did actually in return close their airspace to various kinds of Western companies, and so you see that this tit for tat for closing off of airspace causes yet another logistical challenge that's going on. On top of that, when I talked about the 750 companies that are no longer in Russia, that includes DHL, FedEx, UPS. And so you see that transformation going on as well, as far as just this closure and exodus from that area. And that's leading to another component of it. And the notion of having to find those circuitous routes and finding new ways for logistics, that alone requires additional jet fuel. And jet fuel prices are, like in many of these other areas that we're talking about, those are continuing to rise. And because of that, because of both the cost of that and then coupling that with just the longer flight, they're no longer doing the Straits Point from A to B. They have to find that circuitous route. That actually adds on extra time, which then requires extra jet fuel, which then means you don't have as much room for cargo on the planes. And so you see, again, this ripple effect is something that we keep seeing over and over again. I'd say the Asia Pacific Europe route is one of the ones that has had the biggest hit, and something like cargo has fallen something close to 20%, I think, since the invasion along that route from year to year from last year at the same time. And so we are seeing just magnificent disruptions in that area as they're looking for different ways to have cargo make it to the intended route. The closure of just core airspace that usually was a flyover area or was used for getting from point A to B really has disrupted it quite a bit.
Thank you for that, Dr. Limbago. Turning a bit to some of the direct consequences, let's turn to wheat and both the situation with the wheat crops and exports, but also with some of the end users and importers of wheat and the potential disruptions in those countries and stability in those countries.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I think, when we talk about, starting off with the humanitarian toll, we're going to see that again happening, unfortunately, it probably will not be or remain contained to Ukraine. We're going to see some of the implications in ripple. So you had Ukraine and Russia combined, but Ukraine is a major supplier. supplied about a quarter of the world's wheat. And so that alone helps drive up the food prices. But the food prices for wheat were already quite high. From the start of the pandemic until I think the end of 2021, it jumped something along the lines of 80%, according to the IMF. And so, again, it's exacerbating volatility that was already there and food prices that were already reaching record highs. And while wheat is one of the biggest challenges, it's basically it's a breadbasket of Europe. So you also see with Ukraine and in Russia, barley, rye, sunflower oil, corn. So it's all these massive amounts of grains now are getting disrupted. You're into planting season, so we're seeing disruptions already. And then what may happen, for future exports as well, becomes quite problematic. And for those with, on top of the higher prices, most of those exports, a good percentage of them, go to North Africa and the Middle East. And so those are areas that are already hit fairly significantly with food insecurity. And so again, it's exacerbating that kind of problem, whereas countries, Sudan and Egypt, Turkey, some of those that are some of the big importers of, they're dependent on the wheat from Ukraine. They're going to have yet more shocks and an inability potentially to provide in those areas for their populations, which in turn, as we've seen, food insecurity can lead to other forms. One is the humanitarian toll, which becomes devastating, and then often leads to conflict as well. And so we are likely to see additional kind of effects as the prices spike and as the supply decreases.
Yeah, really, really scary for a lot of reasons. Turning to another commodity, the U.S. government made a wise decision to increase the liquefied natural gas exports to Europe, and in an effort to help lessen the reliance, of course, on Russian energy sources. Does it help? Is it symbolic? Will it reduce prices? Is this more of a long-term play? What's your take?
Yeah, on the one hand, I feel like it's a little too early to tell, and I'll explain why. I think on the one hand, it's a short-term fix. It's something that, the decrease of reliance on Russian oil and gas, natural gas is something that Europe has talked about for a while. There's a big variety as far as how countries are, how far they're willing to go. But I think increasingly this has been sort of the nudge that's provided that. And so the U.S. is helping because Europe receives about 40% of their gas from Russia, and so that is obviously the big dependency of the natural gas. And so I think it's a short-term energy fix, but the problem is that there needs to be a longer-term plan with it. And there are two different considerations that are being discussed right now for at a high level. One is a lot of the infrastructure is not in place to increase some of the transportation. It's not as easy to transport natural gas as it is oil, because there's a lot of different kinds of processing that needs to take place at both the export and the import terminals. And so there's a huge investment in infrastructure that will need to take place to truly get at the numbers that would be required to decrease Europe's dependency on Russia. At the same time, you've got those that are the proponents of clean and green energy want those investments to go towards those areas versus going towards basically reinforcing some of these dependencies on fossil fuels. And so that's why I think it's a little too early to tell. We have seen the U.S. natural gas has hit a 13-year high in the last few weeks. Europe had a pretty high mark in that area for the last year or so. So hopefully it'll help decrease that a little bit on the prices on Europe. But for the most part, I think it's going to be interesting to see what I'll be watching is, will it lead to more investment in infrastructure for the natural gas? And we have seen some examples of that already starting to pop up. Or will it help become part of the broader movement towards green and clean energy? So that's a sort of a TBD on what the longer term impact will be.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm going to bring in our final panelist, and we'll bring you back in for the final round. Renato Scaff is here. He is the Senior Managing Director, Strategy and Consulting, Supply Chain and Operations, and North America Lead at Accenture. Thank you very much for being here. Let me start with a broad question, which is, what have we learned about the economic implications of a global pandemic like this?
Thank you, Suzanne, for having me, and it's been a great dialogue so far. When I think about this, and it's been spoken multiple times already with the earlier questions, right? We really live in a world where our supply chains are very interconnected. We've spent 3 decades building out a global supply chain, really after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as companies rushed out to find the lowest cost option, regardless of location and country. We've also spent probably the last 5 decades kind of following a model created by Toyota of establishing a just-in-time supply chain, which, as we've seen today, has created some issues as we've had some of these disruptions and impacting to the supply chain. As was discussed earlier as well, like the consumption patterns change dramatically, right? We when we get locked down, we move from buying goods, buying services to buying goods. We move from buying in store to buying online, and that puts more stress in terms of the delivery and the overall logistics across the supply chain. Collectively, all that continues to send, the shockwaves and disruptions, and and these continue to drive shortages, as we've talked about. They continue to fuel inflation, right, driving costs up and slow down GDP growth. So it's a really big impact, right, when you look, and I think the other panelists have spoken to it, right? The impact is you just keep peeling back the onion, and there's more and more impact as you go deeper and deeper into it.
No, it's you're exactly right about the complexity. But if I were able to anoint you the king who could fix this, if you were able to weed through the complexity and make the decisions that it took to lessen the disruptions going forward, both from the war on Ukraine and the lockdowns in China, what would you do?
It's interesting. I speak to a lot of chief supply chain officers, right? And those poor souls are just struggling through this, having been on a treadmill for 2 years of nonstop 24-hour days. And by and large, all of them say that they would invest and want better visibility, right? Dr. Limbago talked a little bit about some of the insights that Interos has identified, but today the reality is too few companies truly understand their overall supply chain, and understand not just, they might know their first tier supplier, but when you go to the second tier, third tier, and fourth tier, the supplier, they really don't have that visibility, right? And there's a need to create structural visibility, right? To really allow companies to evaluate the risks and determine strategies how to mitigate it. So everything starts there, of creating that structural visibility, because as we know, all it takes is one component, and another chief supply chain officer talked about it as like the golden bolt. If that one bolt is missing, it shuts down all production because so many pieces are dependent upon it. And so how can we go establish alternative sources, alternate countries of where we can go that golden bolt or other components that we need? And then it's not just a structural visibility, it's a dynamic visibility, because we know that things change daily, hourly, right? As all the impacts that we've been talking about of ports and trains and trucks, et cetera. How do we have that ability how do companies have that ability to sense and react, right? To truly understand what's happening and orchestrate across the supply chain as those perpetual impacts keep taking place. And collectively having that, if I were king for today, collectively, if companies could have that structural and dynamic visibility, it would allow them to kind of better manage through this without really driving kind of costs up in terms of their own operations, right? Which we know ultimately supply chains were always built on people managing efficiencies and driving down costs.
It's a great answer. What we're really seeing across companies is that this is all making purchasing sexy again, right? And so when we see companies moving people from sales to purchasing, because the inventory part is the hardest one to get right now. And I guess that's my next question for you. We see companies thinking about, to your point, I might want to diversify my supplier base so I have more chances of finding that one key piece or part. We have other companies saying, I don't know, I want to be the preferred supplier for the one guy who has the part. And so it'll be interesting to see which strategy becomes dominant going forward. But I guess a broader question for you would be, how much do you think this does change larger inventory control, just-in-time inventory, the global supply chain reliance? I mean, how big of a change do you project this is?
Now, I do think it's a massive change, right? And we know that companies are now looking to kind of how do they rebuild their supply chain. And we've been using the words at times of we're embarking on this great rebuild of supply chain and manufacturing, where after many, many decades of everybody having the same strategy, we're now having to kind of step back and kind of rethink the overall foundation, rethink where you source and how you source, rethink your operating model, your labor and talent strategies, rethink the platforms that you leverage to kind of manage the overall supply chain. And it's a very different calculus today. If you think about it, right, the algorithm historically was all about cost, and you align time and your inventory strategies based on that. The algorithm is much more complicated today because you got to take into account, as we're talking about, resilience and flexibility. You certainly got to take into account net carbon impact and broader ESG impacts, because that is critical in this day and age. So you can't just solve for a simple dimension. You got to solve for the holistic problem. And that's driving a lot of change across the supply chain. We talked earlier about nearshoring and reshoring and all that. I think there's clearly going to be a regionalization of supply chains, and companies are going to look to diversify. You can't afford to be single-threaded on one supplier or one geography. You need to embark on a strategy of diversification and kind of placing bets in different places, and then creating the technology that allows you to be flexible and constantly sense and react.
You know, your concept that what businesses really want is certainty, transparency, a clear-eyed picture in real time is, of course, right and well said. And I think one of the other things people are trying to predict is how long is Russia sidelined? You know, if the conflict were to end on day X, how long does it take for the sanctions to get lifted and for their economy to go back to some sort of stasis? And if that's as long as some people are saying it could be, what's the overall impact there?
It's a wonderful question, right? And it's an amazing one. I mean, Russia spent 3 decades building out the economy that they've had. And if you look there a couple of years ago, it was pretty impressive what they've been able to build out over those 3 decades since the fall of the Soviet Union. As Dr. Limbago called out, right, 750 companies have exited their businesses since the war began. And it's really, to me, just hard to imagine what would make all the conditions right for those companies, including the company I work for, to choose to re-enter, Russia, and for them to play a big part, or to go back to playing as big as a part as they played in the global economy, right? To me, the last call, from what I understand, that you had for this group focused a lot on trust. If I think about the theme for this call is all around risk, and risk mitigation is really the key thing of how do we manage risk. And so to me, the critical question really becomes, what changes need to exist? What changes need to be made for the world to really trust Russia, and to really determine that the risk of doing business is a risk worth taking on? I think that's the critical question. And today, it's just hard to imagine that. And to me, it's sad to think about just how many years it's going to take, and how much change it's going to take, and how far back this took us, and kind of where the world was during the Cold War, which is just, again, very, very sad beyond the humanitarian toll. And what's happening in Ukraine, just to think about kind of the impact to the globe.
I like a lot how you're thinking about this as risk mitigation and risk management. And of course, it's the opposite of certainty, right? And trying to ascertain what your risk level is and get to some certainty. As you're advising companies and helping them think about this, which are the variables people should be watching the most? Is it COVID surges at this point? Is it lockdowns? Is it, the status or potential for a truce for Russia, Ukraine? What variables are you suggesting people watch?
Yeah, I wish it was just a few variables to watch, right? And that's why it's so much more complex right now, of everything, right? There's the geopolitical, there's the surges, there's the reaction, and how governments lock down and respond to it. There's climate change impacts. There's weather impact. It's just, the list is so long. And the reality is, no one can really predict, right? We can't predict how the virus is going to mutate. I talked a little bit about kind of surfing the waves, if you will, as North America right now is slowly starting to tick back up, but certainly dramatically better than it was before. How do we get out and do the things that we couldn't do before when we were at peaks of waves? And there's a little bit of kind of getting used to that and managing through that. But we just don't know, right? We don't know when, there's going to be the next lockdown in a port or in a factory or in a city in China. We know that all those massively affect kind of raw materials sourced across the globe and finished goods throughout the globe. And so the key is really, how do companies build out the capabilities to respond through all these disruptions, right? And I purposely use the word through, not to the disruptions, because when you talk about two disruptions, it almost implies that it's a point in time. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten the question in the last 2 years of people saying, how long are these disruptions going to last? Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? And I always point back to people saying, we're talking about a new normal, and we're talking about years, right? I mean, we talked earlier, right, about the impact to air cargo. And I always go back, for me being a consultant and having a life that I often get on airplanes, or often got on airplanes, people don't realize that 50% of air cargo capacity is in commercial airliners. Well, those commercial airliners aren't flying back and forth to Asia. Well, guess what? That capacity isn't there if I'm not on that plane with it, right? And you're relying then just on the companies that are shipping only air freight. But again, that's only half of the capacity that exists. So, companies need to, constantly just work on the capabilities of how they respond through the disruptions. We've talked earlier about car companies and the impact of chip shortages. Well, they're looking at how do they engineer out some of the chips needed in the car. People don't realize that a luxury automotive today can have as many as 1,000 chips in it. It's not one or two. So are there ways to reduce that so you can, quote unquote, dumb down some of the product, but then at least keep production lines running? And companies are certainly looking and picking which products, which vehicles they manufacture based on demand and profitability. So it's just that ability to respond through it, not guess on any one variable or another.
Yeah, I think the answer to how long are these disruptions going to last, I think the answer is too long. That's the answer. That really appreciate those thoughtful responses. I want to bring all of the panelists back in so we can try to lightning round through some audience questions, if we could, please. This has been so informative and helpful. I can't thank you all enough. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask you to try to keep your answers brief so we can get a number of them in the next few minutes. Dr. Huang, coming back to you first. You just heard a conversation about how businesses are trying to ascertain what's really happening, get the best possible on-the-ground information. And of course, China might be the hardest place to get that information. And so the audience is asking, where do you go to get reliable information on what's happening in China? And do you have any recommendations for the audience if they're trying to figure out for a professional reason how the virus is being managed and the lockdowns are being managed on the ground?
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah. There's certainly some quasi-independent media outlets like Caixin, maybe also China Newsweek, that could provide more reliable information on the situation there. The social media, including WeChat, always is an important source of the information. Because they provide this information on what actually people cope with the pandemic, how the government actually implement the policies, and of course even state media, right? The policy rhetoric sometimes also can tell us some important policy shift there, right? So as I told a reporter, right, when he asked when the policy is going to change, I said, look at the state media, right? When they are no longer highlight the danger of the Omicron, when they no longer, right, they're reporting actively, right, the pandemic response in other countries, when they stop reporting cases on daily basis and they become serious on vaccinating the elderly, but that's a time we're going to expect a policy pivot.
Very, very helpful. Thank you for that. Dr. Limbago, the audience is also asking, you made a reference to ally shoring. They'd like to hear more about it.
Yeah, and that's, it's nearshoring and onshoring. I think to the point of that question is something that's more common. Ally shoring, I think, is gaining a lot more traction because at the end of the day, we no single country can produce everything. I mean, I think to the points that have been made throughout this panel that it's so complex. When you have 1,000 chips making luxury cars, it's impossible for one country to provide every little aspect of every aspect across every supply chain. And so instead of leaning and relying on a lot of the authoritarian governments, which has been the case for the last few decades, instead moving towards trusted networks within governments and then even within companies that you trust to have similar values as far as protection of property rights, civil liberties, even economic similarities. And so the ally shoring really is something that's been popping up, and we're starting to see even some of the old alliance systems that were created in 1945 are shifting quite a bit right now. NATO's one of them. We hear that a lot, and we're seeing that that will in turn have an impact on supply chains. But then also something like the Quad, where you're bringing in India and Australia into more of the U.S. alliance system as well, and so you have supply chain alliances starting to emerge. And I think from supply chains and through basically trusted technology as well, we're going to start seeing and are already seeing this reshuffling of where companies are located and of agreements that are going on across countries to ensure that they've got trusted parts. And to the point on the sanctions, so many companies, there's hundreds of Russian companies that now have been sanctioned that can no longer be part of the supply chain. China as well, from 2019 to 2020, had hundreds of companies that can no longer be part of supply chains in the US and the UK and the EU. And so building out those trusted networks, that's really what ally shoring encompasses. And so I think we're going to continue to see a lot of that going forward.
Very helpful. Thank you. Dr. Herrero, coming to you, you wrote a really interesting article recently about the unintended consequences of the lockdown in China, including increasing isolationism and the disconnect between China and the rest of the world. Could you talk a little bit more about what you see as those unintended consequences?
Yes, so I agree. I mean, we can't forget that China has been locked to the rest of the world, literally, with closed borders, except for draconian quarantine rules for 2.5 years. And that means isolation. And I think we're starting to see the consequences, intended or unintended, I can't judge, of these policies. This is well beyond lockdowns in China. So we can already see that scientific exchanges, business exchanges are affected. We can see, for example, that China's outbound investment in the rest of the world has collapsed since COVID, also lending into the emerging world. Why? Because Chinese can't travel. So it has humongous effects beyond what the discussion today, which is about lockdowns now. But the closed borders do bring isolation. And I think we need to realize that that's one of the factors behind decoupling, because it's the idea of not knowing China anymore as people used to. People can't travel. So that has additional negative rippling effects on the global economy, indeed.
And also on global understanding, right? And coming together as people to solve big challenges. So thank you for that. Renato, I wonder if I can give you the last question. It's going to be this. I like to end on a somewhat positive note. So we've talked a lot about the challenges in the world today, the complexities of the global supply chain, but companies have also been innovating through this. And so what do you think the big opportunities or innovations that have come out of this have been?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think there are positives, right? I'm certainly a glass half full person, so I'm always looking for the positives. The rate of innovation is going to accelerate dramatically in supply chain, right? There's lots of companies like Interos, as well as Project 44 and FourKites and others that are helping drive that visibility. A lot of innovation there. There's a lot in terms of automation and robotics that's driving a large part of what we're dealing with is around labor shortages, right? As parts of the world are locked down and labor shortages all over the planet, and that's pushing and accelerating innovation in that space, right? Of things that we can do and be more independent of humans doing it. And then third, I would say, sustainability, right? We're clearly at a moment in time right now that we've gotten past the point of it's time to act, right? It's not time to talk about anymore. Some of the conferences and the things that have really now made it clear kind of the impacts of climate change. And I do think, one potential silver lining, for example, of the oil and gas impacts of Russia, invasion of the Ukraine is an acceleration as countries and companies look towards energy security, to look at how to accelerate their energy transition to sustainable sources. We all know we have to do that. Every CEO has made commitments of when their companies are going to be carbon neutral or carbon positive, right? And making impacts there. And I think, this could have a potential impact of accelerating our path in that direction, which would be a wonderful thing.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being such a wonderful panel of experts, for clarifying a lot of information for us. It has been a great panel. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. The Chamber Foundation feels strongly that part of its mission is to educate the public on complex issues like this. It's also part of its mission to help us all do good in the world. And you can find more information on the U.S. Chamber Foundation's website about the best ways to provide humanitarian aid in Ukraine. So we look forward to seeing you for our next installment of Path Forward in May. And until then, be well.